Niddelnacht. Has anybody heard of Niddelnacht? It is a strange, obscure Ashkenazi Jewish custom and holiday. And I want to tell you a bit about it, and I want you to keep your minds open as we talk about it a bit. Because you will see that it is a strange holiday. It's difficult for us to relate to today. So what do we usually do on Jewish holidays? We eat. Okay, Christmas is kosher Chinese food, okay. But we eat. Food is a big part of Jewish holidays. Gathering, celebration is a big part of Jewish holidays. Oftentimes, there's some Torah study involved, right? Coming to synagogue, and there's prayers and things like that. Niddelnacht has none of that. Niddelnacht, we're not supposed to study Torah. It's actually one day a year we're supposed to not study Torah at all. We're not supposed to have lights on in our homes and in our synagogues. We're not supposed to gather together. There's custom some people have to play chess or cards or other little things. There's a custom to eat garlic to ward off some of the evil spirits of the night. And the question is, why is there this holiday? Why did this holiday develop in the 17th century in the Ashkenazic communities in Eastern Europe to avoid gathering, to turn out the lights, to not go to synagogue, to not go to the Beit Midrash and to study Torah? Why is there a holiday to sit alone or in very, very small groups at our homes in the dark? Not much of a holiday, yes. It is true. But the question is, why did it develop? And the answer is the context. It developed because of what someone else said tonight starts, Christmas. And in these Christian lands, where anti-Semitism was rampant, where we know that our ancestors were persecuted on and off for centuries, there were better and there were worse times. There weren't a lot of really good times in that part of the world for the Jewish people back then. And it was that this holiday was developed in the Ashkenazi communities to essentially protect us, to keep us from large gatherings, to keep us from having opportunities for there to be mass violence. As Christians came home from evening mass on Christmas, riled up by a fiery sermon, and looking for people to take it out on, right? Those who, according to some, killed their Lord and Savior. And so we have this strange holiday, which when I first heard about it, I thought it was a joke. Then when I realized the person telling me about it was serious, I thought, oh my gosh, this is an incredibly offensive holiday. One of the customs is to eat garlic to ward off souls. We deliberately don't study Torah. One of the reasons given behind that custom is so that way the souls of Jesus isn't helped to rise up as we study Torah in honor of those we've loved and lost, to help the ascension of their soul to heaven is a Kabbalistic custom. But the real reason is simply that, to protect us from not gathering together. And so the answer is we often need to look at context. So I want to return to something that we spoke about a month or so ago and still been in and out of the news after the whole controversy with Kanye West and the awful things that he said, and then Dave Chappelle's stand-up act on Saturday Night Live. And one of the lines he said is, if they're black, it's a gang. If they're Italian, it's a mob. But if they're Jewish, it's a coincidence, and you should never, ever speak about it. And he was talking about the idea that Jews control Hollywood, and his riff on this idea that he's seen a lot of Jews there, but we're not allowed to talk about it. And I think it's important because there's a piece of this conversation that's been left out a bit, and it's the context. Because it's true. Historically, there have been a lot of Jews who found great success in Hollywood. And the question is then why? Why is that the case? What allowed them to get there? And it's important, I think, that we do talk about the context, because if not, it's something that people can jump to their own conclusions. Much like the invention of Niddelnacht, Jewish success in Hollywood came really out of anti-Semitism. There were Jewish immigrants who were not welcome in other fields when they first came to the United States. They could go into many different professions, even in theater, which was thought of as high class, actors performing live audiences. Jews faced great anti-Semitism to break into it at the time. But Hollywood, which many saw as this immoral new field, this new thing that was creating and invented, the moving pictures, there Jews found success. Many of them changed their names, many of them hid their Judaism, but many of the early major figures of both those creating movies and those starring in them were Jews. And they found success there, not because of a conspiracy, but because it was the only field that they could succeed in at the time. The context of it matters. And it's important to talk about how this came to be, that there were so many Jews in Hollywood. Interestingly, last year when the Academy of Motion Pictures Museum was unveiled in Los Angeles, it left out the Jewish story. Many accused it of, again, being this idea of anti-Semitism, of imagining that there are so many Jews in Hollywood that the story didn't need to be told. Thankfully, later next year, a new exhibit is supposed to be unveiled which will tell the story of many of the Jewish founders of Hollywood and why they went there as opposed to elsewhere. It's another area we see a lot of things in, Jewish hospitals. And a number of years ago, a candidate for provincial parliament in Quebec suggested that Montreal's Jewish General Hospital remove the word Jewish from its name and just be General Hospital. Why did they think that? It's a little strange in the modern world for a hospital to be labeled as if it only takes care of people of a particular faith. The truth is, anyone who knows that Jewish hospitals, whether it's in Montreal, the Jewish General Hospital, or Mount Sinai here in Toronto, or hospitals all across North America, they may cater and specialize in dealing with religious Jewish communities, but they help anyone in need. And their patients and doctors come from all faiths. But the question is the context. Why is it that there are Jewish hospitals to begin with? Anyone? The only place they could practice. Early on, many different careers excluded Jews from participating, and medicine was a big one of those. The few medical schools that would accept Jewish students, they found a problem after when they went to go find a place to do their residency, these new Jewish doctors. Most hospitals would not hire them. And hence, these Jewish hospitals, places for these young Jewish doctors to not face discrimination, to be able to start their careers, were important. And many Jewish patients in other hospitals found that their religious beliefs were not well respected. From issues of kashrut and Shabbat, to people on their deathbed being counseled to accept Jesus lest they be damned to hell for eternity. And so, Jewish hospitals were developed, not to exclude others, but to create a space for Jews to be safe. It's another popular anti-Semitic trope we see in the world, that Jews are money lenders. We control the banks. We control finance. And where does that come from? Again, it was one of the few fields they could come into. It was a response to the anti-Semitism that Jews faced in the Middle Ages. In medieval Christian lands, money lending is something that the church forbade. And so it was one of the few career paths that Jews were permitted to enter into because it was something that Jews were needed for. Because society needed people to lend money, the communities needed people to lend money, and yet the Christian inhabitants weren't able to do so. And so Jews were invited to participate in this as one of the few occupations they could do. And what happened? They succeeded. Some of them succeeded very well. And yet they still face much anti-Semitism, with rulers taking their money, reneging on contracts, and refusing to honor deals. But today it's become this anti-Semitic trope. But the reality is it's true. There are Jews involved in banking and finance, and there are families that have been in that for generations. But the answer is not that it's a conspiracy. It's the context of where this developed. Similar with many other businesses. Jews throughout history have been accused of being middlemen. Rather than producing something or being the end point, being the ones who just move it from place to place, right? Import, export. How many people have a family member who's in the import-export business? It's been a long time. It's been a long time Jewish business. Why again? Because other occupations in these ancient communities were excluded from Jews. So they had to have these different jobs where they brought things from one city to another and they sold it and they transported it. The jobs that their Christian and Muslim neighbors did not want to have. And so what's the point of all of this? We read today the story of Joseph. We began it last Shabbat. We'll continue it for a couple of more Shabbatot. And what happens at the end of the story of Joseph? He's second in command of all of Egypt. He's in charge. He's powerful. He's an important political figure. He controls the wealth of Egypt and the food. And what happens after that? When the book of Bereshit ends, we begin the book of Shemot, and our ancestors are enslaved in Egypt. Ve'akam melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He looked around this king, this Pharaoh, and saw the Jews were successful, that they were doing really well, that there were a lot of them. And he was scared what might happen to the Egyptians and his own kingdom and his own power. And so, maybe the most well-known example of anti-Semitism in the Torah, or in Jewish history, the Israelites were enslaved. Our ancestors were taken captive. Their possessions taken from them and forced instead to do slave labor. And I bring all this together because I think it's important to talk about the context. Because Pharaoh woke up one day and saw where the Jewish people were and forgot how they got there. And that led to some of his hatred and his fear. Because it's easy to jump to conclusions. It's easy to see that there are many Jewish families very successful in finance and banking and to assume that there's some kind of conspiracy that got them there. This is why we need to talk about the history. It needs to be taught not just in Jewish communities, but as part of history that's taught in high schools and universities. That medieval Christian lands forced Jews into the field of money lending. The story of Jewish hospitals, that Jews were excluded from participating in other hospitals as doctors, were excluded from the medical profession. It needs to be talked about. And whether you loved, hated, or something in between what Dave Chappelle said, the fact is, anybody who looks at Hollywood sees that and recognizes that the Jewish people, our people, have found great success in the land of TV and movies. And there's a choice to either pretend like it's not the case or to acknowledge it and make sure we tell the story of why it happened, of the persecution, the discrimination, the anti-Semitism that our ancestors faced, which led them to go from the east to the west, to move to Los Angeles, to move to Hollywood, which led them to change their names, many of them to hide their Jewishness early on in their careers. As they built studios, as they wrote screenplays, as they became actors and musicians and all sorts of other creative jobs. These weren't jobs that were looked up to as glamorous by much of the country. They were looked at as immoral, as loose, as this new subpar form of theater, of performance, that was looked at with disdain by many of the elites. And that's why Jews found success in Hollywood. So our parsha today, I think, reminds us, the narrative of Joseph, that it's important to not just remember how the story ends, but to go back to the beginning. Joseph didn't have some plot or some plan to rule Egypt. He was sold by his brothers into slavery. He didn't have a choice in that. He was bought by Potiphar and his wife and made a servant, and not his choice, thrown in jail. And despite all of that, he was able to succeed as Pharaoh took him out of jail and gave him a job, an opportunity to save himself and his people. It wasn't a conspiracy that led Joseph to the top. It was determination. It was hard work, despite every obstacle someone could throw at him. It's not conspiracy that our people have done well in all sorts of different industries. But it's that despite discrimination, anti-Semitism, obstacles, and persecution, we've continued to work hard. We've continued to make education an important value in our families and our communities. And we've continued to help each other. Not just when one of us rises up to a position of power, assimilating and moving on and forgetting everyone else, but to help lift each other up and build each other up. And it's how we've remained strong for over 2,000 years. It's how we'll continue to remain strong in the future. Shabbat Shalom. Happy Hanukkah. Happy Rosh Chodesh. Happy birthday, Esther. And I don't know if it's Happy Nilma, but enjoy. Shabbat Shalom.